Confusion matrix. Confusion matrix. Confusion matrix.
The confusion matrix. Confusion.
We're rolling. Welcome back, everybody. Hello, Pete.
Yep. Hello.
How are you doing? Yeah, I'm very, very good on Good Friday. And I keep on getting confused about what day of the week it is because I was off yesterday as well. And I'm off the next few days. And it's all very confusing. So let us talk about what we're going to talk about. So we've both got some stuff to bring to the table today. And I will start since I'm already yapping on. So in my most recent contract, I've sort of been retooling myself a bit, partly due to necessity and partly due to, let's do something different, folks. Let's do something new and exciting and play with some new toys. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so what am I talking about would be a good start. I'm talking about Marimo, which is a Python, strictly Python notebook software. So something along the lines of Jupyter and Jupyter Lab and various others, like the native stuff you get with Databricks and the like. And I listened to a podcast about it and I thought, wow, this sounds interesting. I'll give that a go. Sort of thinking, I'll just, sit here in front of the TV and noodle with it a bit and see if I want to maybe try it some more at a later date. And then was so sort of taken with it, I've thrown myself head first into the Marimo only mode. Mm-hmm. And I'm there, I'm using it, I'm all over it. I'm not a late adopter, but I'm not an early adopter either. And I do like new toys, like most of us technically orientated people. But I'm not the sort of person that finds a tool, something new and decides, tries to apply it to basically everything that I do. If you've got a hammer, everything looks like a nail and all that business. That's not really me, right? If it's not going to improve my life or my productivity or something significantly and fairly immediately, I get bored quite quickly and move on. Mm-hmm. So me wholesale adopting something new is not necessarily a common thing for me, and it is probably a big thumbs up for Marimo.
I was just going to interject and say, just for our listeners to say that the work we do, we tend to live in notebooks quite a lot, especially when doing a lot of data analysis, because they're just the quickest and easiest way to navigate data and get results without having to go heavy into the software development side of things. So we kind of live in Jupyter Lab and Jupyter Notebooks.
Well, no, it's a good call. Actually, why notebooks before we go into why Marimo? Oh. And I think it's what you've just said, plus the statefulness. That you would otherwise get via something like IPython or, perhaps some of the IDEs, certainly RStudio, and the visualness that doesn't come so readily with the CLI tools, and, the ability to render images directly in line with the code, and nestled among Markdown, which means that you can build quite rich notebooks that are self-documenting, and also use some tools like, I have this thing that shows some feature of our customer base in a certain way. I save that notebook and I'll bring it up every time I need it. It's not epic enough that it needs to be plumbed into Power BI or Tableau or something. It's only really for me and maybe another couple of people. It sits in a notebook because it's doing something quite complicated. And so it's a proxy app, right?
Yeah.
And you can even do things like with iPy widgets and stuff, you can do sort of interactive drop-downy type things. which will, automatically pivot a data frame or something.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. But I'm saying that very much, sort of bookends, a typical data-focused data science piece of work where you're having to pull the data together. So you want a bunch of tools to do that. But essentially, you're going to prove something. So you want to be able to present that to people. But going beyond that, as in making it a tool for teams or reams of people to use, is not really in the purview, because then you get into all sorts of, how is this going to be supported? What happens when it goes wrong? So, our end point tends to be, well, here's the data, here's how we could use it, like you say, as a small team of 2 or 3 people around a laptop, possibly even going over a network to provide the tool to someone else. But it's always on the proviso of, this is not production ready. And so it's a great endpoint for us notebooks, because you can get to that extra level rather than having to copy and paste into a PowerPoint or a presentation, for example. And you can actually, like you say, bring up a few tools, interact, show data nicely on screen, go through one set at a time with some documentation. You can have text in there. It can almost become its own presentation piece, which can actually then get saved and served, viewed via HTML. So they're very, very useful, and they really do represent, our sort of life cycle. So yeah, just to underline that really as to why we're less bothered about, production ready stuff, and why we don't spend months building out fully fledged software.
Well, we do that too. And so I think we could sink a whole series of episodes on the uses, abuses, and problems with both the notebook paradigm and specifically the Jupyter ecosystem. And I think maybe we should, because it's, as you point out, so completely central to how people in our trade see the world. Mm-hmm. But it is worth noting the issues with Jupyter that Marimo looks to alleviate. I wasn't looking for an alternative to Jupyter. I use Jupyter Lab, and I've got a bunch of extensions. I have Vim bindings enabled. I've set up an environment that's fairly conducive within the realms of Jupyter's capability in its own particular nuanced way of delivering things. It is the granddaddy. It is the benchmark for notebook platforms. We shifted to Databricks a couple of years ago for a while, because it was the environment where we were working, and I missed Jupyter because at that point the Databricks notebook wasn't particularly good. Anyway, what's the problem with Jupyter? What's the big problem? Well, the big problem is that it can get quite chaotic, right? Because if you write a script, a program, a Python or R or something, and you encapsulate it in sort of functions, and you might have a command line option or whatever it is you're doing, it's going to run from top to bottom, right? It might not necessarily be passed in that order, but the code is set up to be run linearly, right? Mm-hmm. Unless you set it up otherwise. Whereas in a notebook, the code cells can be run in any order, right? And although there are ways of sort of chaining them together and dictating the order, the default state for us lazy data scientists is not, right? Is to say, well, you sort of start at the top and you go down to this cell and this, skip that one. No, that one's got some bollocks in it, but I didn't want to delete it. I haven't got around to moving it to the bottom or something. Oh, you do this. Oh shit, I put the import for this right down there when I was just experimenting and I never moved it to the top. So this cell doesn't run. And you get into a spaghetti junction of code with dependencies that might be all over the notebook. The people who like to work fast and agile like us tend to gloss over this issue by sort of having ways of working and the mindset that, oh yeah, I just need to remember to go down there and run that one first, and I'll get round to fixing this all later, right? Because it's not such an untidy mindset. It's what allows us to work so quickly. Because if you try and keep everything tidy as you go along, it takes a lot longer, and a lot of the time, what we're cooking up isn't. We're just experimenting. We don't know that this is what we want. If I cut it this way, do this, put it over here, stick it in this data frame, blah, blah, blah. Does it get me what I want? No, right. That's all going in the bin, right? We are very, very used to throwing code away, right?
Yeah.
That to other styles of developer, they would think we were nuts, right? But most of our code is disposable, right? So we get to work in that way. And it's a bit like, you're a chef, and you're in the kitchen before the restaurant opens, and you're saying, well, I'm just going to experiment with this new pasta dish that I've got an idea there for. And you might have a few different pots with a few different versions on the go, add a bit of this, move a bit of that around, and you're not tidying up. You've got pots all over the place, and you've created a big old mess. But in the end, one of those pots in the middle has got, some sort of manna from heaven in it, and the rest of them are going to go in the bin, right? And this is not what's going out to the guests, the diners. This is just you playing around. It's you Heston Blumenthaling it, right? And this is something that happens regularly, and this is sort of how we work. The final product, if it's going to go into any sort of end user or production environment, will be tidied up to the nth degree. But most of what we do is not that, right? You with me?
Yep.
Thus far?
Yep.
It describes our mode of existence quite well.
Yeah.
I like thinking of myself as like the chef. I call myself Aloigi. I think I would be an Italian chef. What about you?
A bit penchant for français myself,
Oh, really? Oh, very la-di-da. No, I'll be a pizza chef called Luigi. Right. Right. So I should actually talk about the thing that I meant to talk about, which is Marimo. So it's been created by a couple of guys whose name is not, it eludes me right now, but they set out to create a Python first, pure Python notebook that sort of transcended some of these issues specifically, right? So rather than trying to recreate the everything to everyone thing that Jupyter is, because you can run obviously R and other things like SQL as well, they sort of set out to make something that was much more laser focused, and the big thing that which is both, depending on your mindset here, this is either the most amazing thing ever or a complete horror show. The real big thing they set out to tackle was this ordering of things, right? The natural chaos that arises in notebooks, which sort of puts it between, the all in chaos, anything goes, Jupyter world, and something much more production orientated, like you get in Databricks and I guess Snowflake and places like that. That it sort of forces you to behave better, to be a better citizen from the outset, right? Because it enforces the order, right? So basically you can put the cells in any order you like, but it infers the natural ordering, which makes a lot of sense when you think about it. And it's sort of how scripts run, right?
Yeah.
Because more or less you can put functions or methods in any order. It doesn't matter, right? But the thing that's executing at that point in time is what matters, and then what that knows what to call, right? Yeah. And the Python kernel knows, well, this variable is here, which points to there and is used over here and stuff. And that's all it's really doing, right? And so it says, well, this variable X is defined in this cell, and variable X is used in this other cell. Therefore, the first cell needs to be run first, regardless of where it is in the order of cells, right?
Yeah.
So you can, for example, put your imports at the bottom, and it just knows to run them first, right?
Yeah.
And that is marvelous, right? But you've got a few side effects of this, which is, for example, you can't redefine variables, right? Because it can't keep track of them, right? Now, this seemed like a small thing when I started looking at this, going, I can handle that, until you realise that lazy data scientists like us, we love to redefine variables, because what we say is df equals pd.readcsv file inwards, and then you go df dot I don't know, rename, or df dot something else, and and you do a bit of that, and you might have a few redefinitions in the same cell, and then you have another go at it, another 5 cells on, and you're redefining the df variable constantly, right? Which is a very common behavior for data scientists. Now, in the interview with this guy, he was saying, well, look, we're in functional land here, like pandas and polars and various other equivalents are functional first, right? They might give you the whole in place equals true thing, so you can go non-functional. But they are functional, even if we abuse that paradigm. I mean, the reality is that all of those transforms, to the point you needed them, should have been done in a dotted string, right? In a single statement. And that's what they're saying, right? And if you're going to create a new variable, you need to mean it, right?
Yeah.
Rather than have it just as a side effect, because especially in functional programming, but in general, side effects are a bad thing, and having lots of dangling variables around the place pointing towards a single pointer in memory is not only inefficient, it's untidy, and will and does inevitably lead to problems arising, which in a notebook are particularly hard to diagnose, right? Because if you've got it in Jupyter and you're redefining this variable all over the place, and something's gone wrong, you've put a transform in there, for example, that you're going, well, no, I don't want that anymore. I was just experimenting with that, and now it's somewhere in my execution tree. Like, and where the hell is it? Right? Where the hell am I doing that? And you lose 10 minutes finding it, right?
Yeah.
Whereas if, for example, you were just writing a script or a class or something, that's not a problem, right? You just go find a definition, right? So you with me so far?
Yeah. I mean, just to clarify, I hadn't really. I've only touched in Marimo, and I've not really hammered it yet. And I hadn't really thought about the data frame variable. Because you think of variables, you just think, like you say, oh yeah, it won't be a problem. X equals 16. I'll just do it all in the same place. So I was just thinking of a scenario there, which is quite typical. So, like you say, you load up a data frame, you sort of take a look at it, then you do a clean columns, that looks good. Then you decide, now I can see that. Now I'll drop some columns, and that might take you over 3 or 4 cells. So you're saying that in that 4th cell where you do df.drop, it's going to complain about it. And then what you should really do is merge all of those cells back into one.
Yes. So hold on. If you're doing df.drop in place equals true, then you're fine. If you're doing df equals df.drop, then it will complain immediately. Won't even let you run it, right? Yeah. It's got, no, you're not doing that, mate, right? And so if you want to break your execution, your work on that data frame up into multiple components, I do this pivot first, and I want that pivot, right? And I don't want it to be transformed again, but there is a downstream transform of that pivot that I want, right?
Yeah.
What you should be doing is copying that pivot to another variable, right? Rather than sort of doing it halfway through, right?
Yeah.
That's good practice.
Yeah.
Right. And you might get a bit shirty about like memory management here, but actually Pandas is pretty good at that, right? And it's pretty good at complaining when you're doing things that are in danger of violating the sort of memory management side and the coherence of downstream or upstream instances of a data frame, right?
Yeah.
Because they're all just pointers around things, right? And it's one of the things that Marimo exists to sort of help prevent is those types of bugs that arise from chaining up lots of variables with different sort of windows onto the same data frame, the same data set in memory.
Yeah.
Right. If you can manipulate it without changing the underlying data, it's still the same data. Right. So, and that you and me know painfully well can lead to all sorts of nastiness. is just playing fast and loose.
Okay.
And so what do you do when that type of fast and looseness is kind of essential to how you're working, right? And this is where Marimo is make or break, right?
Yeah.
And it would have been break to me because I understand why that level of coherence is desirable, right? But if I'm moving rapidly, and knowing that a lot of this code is going in the bin, I don't want it bitching at me for redefining variables saying fuck, right? I just want to get my thing done. And the way we work sort of accepts for the fact that things can go wrong, right? We have to go back and tidy up after ourselves every now and again, right? Yeah. And it's fine, right? It's just how we do things. That's why we work so quickly, right? So it should have been a deal breaker, but until I noted that Marimo has this sort of default auto execution. It basically sort of says that since all your code is coherent and linked up, right, that that if you change something, you must want everything downstream of that to be rerun, right? So it will just rerun. I mean, you can disable it, but by default, it reruns everything, right? Which can be problematic if in that rerun chain you've got like I'll load these 7 terabytes of text data, which you don't necessarily want to do that, but there are various other ways around that you can act quite agilely, not least using polars, which is lazy by default. But anyway, but what I found was that look, a lot of the time we have a good habit of once we get a sort of cut of data that we've used more than once, it just goes in our back-end library, right? We've got like some config that says do this, our little library we call Mave,
yeah.
and she has recipes for creating data frames, right? And so you sort of pack it off to the back end and say, well, I don't want to ever have to do this again, and I want it available in your notebook. So we push everything off to config. And if it doesn't go into config, we'll push it off into another notebook or a Python file anyway, right? So what I found I was doing, because I can now have a NeoVim session open on one side and the notebook open on the other. And indeed, the notebooks themselves in Marimo are pure Python, right? And so you can actually edit the notebook directly in NeoVim or whatever IDE you're using, PyCharm or something, right? And that next time you hit save, the notebook's just going to run again, right? Because you've done something upstream, right? So what I've been doing is essentially importing a local file that I'm writing on the left, done a bit of stuff, need to update that data frame. Basically, I'm updating the core of that data frame. So I'll chuck it in a function on the left, right? Wow. And it's forcing me to keep a very tidy code environment. And again, you and me are pretty fastidious about moving code out of notebooks, right?
Yeah.
Because it's really, really hard to maintain, and it causes a lot of mess and a lot of unnecessary scrolling and the possibility of, messing up your control flow and stuff, right? So yes, it is causing me some inflow agility headaches. Yeah, a bit, right? Is it forcing me to work in a way that I naturally want to anyway? Yes, it is, right?
Yeah.
And so I then tidy up a lot more frequently and push stuff out to this very ramshackle module, Python module, and then quickly found myself tidying stuff up into classes, right?
Okay.
Like really quick. Just no, this needs to be done. Well, I've got all these reference data frames that are being merged in here and there because I've effectively replicated a relational database locally in Parquet files.
Yeah.
And I just now boot it up. It rerun that Marimo runs everything. It ingests all of my reference files into a central class, which uses Mave at the back end, and I've just got everything there. It's just available to me, right? And then I just load data, and it just does everything, right? And so now I can fire up a notebook, and this has been our dream forever, right? Just fire up a notebook, and the notebook is for this client on this project, and you've got an environment immediately that's got everything you want right there, and runnable, and in good shape, right? And so, and this is it's providing an environment where I can edit on the left, and the moment I save, it refreshes on the right. So you've got 2 windows into the same notebook ecosystem, and potentially 3 if you want to edit the Python file for the notebook directly, right?
Yeah.
So for me, I'm like, this is some level of magic. And then it's got loads of integration. So it's got a much more native integration of AI Copilot than the one that comes with Jupyter Lab that I was using. Its implementation of Vim bindings is native and more sane. Although I had to relearn a few shortcuts. It's got a few problems. There aren't enough shortcuts. You can't shortcut a lot of stuff that I think you should be able to.
Yeah.
And it's still a little bit vanilla in some areas. But you can run SQL in it. It renders Markdown well. It's very presentable and very neat and very tidy and neat and tidy environment. It's just like, my office at home here is a cluttered mess, right? It's like going into the office. That's what Marimo's like. From the cluttered mess of my home office to a swanky office on the sort of London bank of the Thames.
Yeah.
Right? That's what it feels like. A bit more grown up.
In one.
So there you go. I'm a convert today.
Wow.
Ask me again next week, because I probably threw it out and decided to go back to Jupyter, or I found something new. I don't know. Wasn't there one called Zeppelin at some point?
Yeah,
Was that still around?
I don't know.
Anyway, so look, I could talk about this for a while, but I'm not gonna. But that's good. That's for me. I'm a believer. I recommend you try it.
Yeah, I mean, I'll sort of run through a couple of the demos on there. I mean, it threw me. Yeah, it's one of those first 2 minutes where you look at the screen and go, I don't understand what's going on, because like you say, we're so used to working with the Jupyter way of doing things. And of course, the first thing it had was, a cell with an answer in it, and the code was in the cell below it. And I'm looking at that, and I was just sort of staring at it. And I was going,
you can flip that, right? That's just a setting.
Oh yeah,
right?
I know.
So
I know
you
you've
can
got
just
the
like-
result above it, but also because you can put cells in any order, it's got a result cell and then the definition underneath it. I'm looking at that, going, "Well, how on earth are you doing that?" And I'm just sort of staring at it.
Yeah, but you can flip it. You can flip it in settings, so it does it the Jupyter way.
No,
right?
but I mean, I don't mean the result cell. I actually mean as in you've got 2 cells, and cell 1 has.
Oh, I see. Got you. So
yeah.
the order.
Yeah,
right.
and cell 2 has load DF, and I'm going, well, how can you display the DF before you've loaded it? And I'm sort of, I just had that moment where I went to sort of look, and I'm just staring at it and just going, what? And it's going, run this cell. I'm running the cell and thinking, what? So it's just that first 2 minutes, and it really threw me. And then it gets onto the, well, here's your definitions and your references, and we'll run the define so you can put them in. Oh, right, I see. And then suddenly, that's quite exciting because it means that, like you say, you can put your imports at the bottom. So, as we talked about earlier, when you want to actually show and share the notebook with somebody, it's always been a problem with notebooks where you go, and I remember we used to put this in notebooks. You'd have a big section and you'd be a collapsible section, and we'd put in big, bold, run this, but do not look at it, for people that work with code. And because you've got all this code up front, and that can now go below. So your first cell can be the answer, that just takes a little bit of, like I say, that first it just takes some getting used to. First looking at it, I was just so confused that I was paralyzed for about 15 seconds.
Well, and I think that it's jarring and it could be seen as a problem, but there's so many sort of things in place to help account for that. For example, you can get an execution DAG graph, right? So there's just a tab on the left where it will show you which, as in a visual graphical way, what cells depend on what, right. and so you just get this big sort of execution tree, and it's just an instantiation of the DAG, the directive acyclic graph that basically powers Marimo. It just, everything depends on this graph that it builds in the background, and you can just go look at it. So the order of the cells, as someone who reads a book from left to right, top to bottom, I think you can find it quite jarring, but that's not how coding works. So, if you want to know what that linear view is, you can have it, right? It's just not the default view, right?
Yeah.
I just think it's a really smart way of looking at this because we know the problems with notebooks. Like, for example, Jupyter's a big bloody JSON file that has embedded data, right? And it means it doesn't play nicely with Git. It means it's actually quite hard to share among teams, whereas Marimo doesn't embed data or visualizations or anything like that. It's in pure Python, and so it's just gettable right out of the box, right? So just so many little things like that.
Yeah, no, and that's been a real thorn in our side for a long time. And the other thing I really liked as well, I mean, we, like I say, moving into GUI type stuff, so you can create little widgets and tools. It's not a major part, but you get towards the ends of projects and stuff, and it is the sort of thing you want to pull out. And that's always been slightly problematic in Notebook, because if you have to manage everything, right? And what I quite like to do is I was showing a slide and I thought, oh yeah, they were doing this, like you're saying, data bricks, how you can visualize a data frame. And like, yeah, it's all sort of good, but it's all just like, I'm never really going to use it. But of course, because you've got a slider, which is, a variable, and the slider changes the value of that variable, it then runs all the cells off of that. And I'm looking at that and suddenly going, oh, right. So basically it's taking care of everything which I'd have to hand craft. I mean, it's not a lot of handcrafting once you get into it, but because we don't do it a lot, when you come back to it, it's always a bit of a reminding going on. Whereas here, you're just going to say, oh, okay, well, here, knock up this GUI, I've got this slider, it's going to run off this variable, and when I move it, it's going to run all the cells I need. Great. Again, that's half the problem with traditional notebooks.
Yeah, and it's got native widgets as opposed to IPy widgets.
Yeah.
And any notebook can be run as an app and served as a standalone app, right? Well, and but the downside is there's not really, I don't know if I've not looked hard, I don't think there's a plugin ecosystem yet. The styling options and the theming options are a bit thin on the ground, but I've got my beloved Grovebox theme on it, which is another thing that wasn't working on Jupyter. And so, there's trade-offs here, but it's a young product, and it's evolving rapidly, and the guys that are working on it work on it full time. So I'm really looking forward to seeing where it goes.
Yeah.
Hopefully they don't break it. Enough about me preaching about Marimo. What do you got for us?
Well, a bit of a shifting gears. I was going to talk a bit about distributions in data, and we did mention it a few episodes ago, the 80-20 rule. So I just sort of kind of wanted to go back over what it is and how I stumbled upon it fairly recently. So I was just working on a project and it had some data. It was business analysis data presentation about this company. Now, I don't know if the data was particularly real, but it was modeled to make it appear like a real company. And it was a small book publishers, and it was analysis over about 2 or 3 year period on the number of books they had published and how much revenue they'd gotten and how many copies they had sold. And it was comparing fiction with non-fiction and also digital with real life books. So it only had, from memory, it was about sort of dozen or so different titles. So you're not talking about a big publishing house here. And what was in the data was a classic, which was out of the fiction books. There was one book which was like selling 25 to 50 times more than all the others put together. And it was the same. They had a digital book, which I think might have been a non-fiction one, which was doing the same. So it was this classic skew of data where effectively, you're knocking around with 20 odd books and making money. But 2 or 3 of those are making more money than all the rest put together. So it's the 80-20 rule. You've got sort of, or 90-10, you've got 10 or 20% of your product making 80 to 90% of your revenue and profit. We mentioned this before, the sort of classic distribution, and we've seen it crop up again and again in business. And one of the things that really struck me about this, because it was in publishing, and when I was writing scripts with the UK Film Council back in the early 2000s, one of the things the UK Film Council was born out of lottery money. And so they were a government body that was trying to effectively, get more of a British film industry up and running. And of course, at the time, basically it was competing with Hollywood. So what up until that time, British films have been very good at, you'd always get a runaway hit. And, Britain was and still is, I think, very, very known for, high technical quality, some good writers, good directors, good actors, but not necessarily en masse, and also not very repeatable. So what you'd have is you'd have a sort of new producer come out of film school, do that classic thing in the arts of just happen to get the right things all together, all at the right time. And no one still, even in Hollywood, knows what that formula is. And then they would go off and have a hit, and people would go, oh, great, newest director, newest producer, let's go and work with them. And then they'd have 5 clunkers. And so they'd make money kind of almost randomly, but weren't able to repeat that. So the UK Film Council was brought together, and they took to create this industry, and they focused on producers, and they wanted producers to have a slate of films. Well, what's a slate of films? Well, what they're saying is, if you make 5 films, one's probably going to do really well and the others maybe not so well, and you'll probably have a couple of clunkers in there. But overall, you kind of make money, and you're making the 4 living off of that one. So again, it was exactly the same scenario, right? You've got the sort of 80-20, 90-10, one big hero pulling on all the rest. And it made me think, one of the things about this presentation I saw on this publishing firm was the implication was it was a fairly young firm, like they'd sort of published one book and they thought, oh, this is quite good, we'll do a few. And it made me think about what those first few, how do they land for you? Because if they're in the 80% and you start a business and you publish 2 or 3 books and they all sell, I don't know, 10,000 copies, and you're making a business of that, that's good. And if you keep doing that, then you've got a nice little business running. You've got, selling 10,000 copies might be reasonable. I'm just plucking that number out of the air, by the way. And so you roll along and, you build a company around that. It might not be a massively big company, or it might grow over time. And then occasionally, 1 in every 10 or 2 in every 10, you you get the big winner, and then that sort of higher tide raises all boats sort of deal. But I was thinking, if you started and one of your first 3 books happened to be the hero one, you could completely miscue on that and think, well, wow, I'm in a business here of selling 100,000 copies a book. This other one here that sold 10,000. Well, that's obviously just bad luck. And so you could then, create a presentation, go and ask for money, and get investment on these sort of, like the 2 out of 3 books which have sold 100,000 copies. And you could then spend doing the next 18 books and only getting the 10,000 because the 2 you hit just happened to be, through randomness, the top 10% rather than the actual body. And and I think it was that the idea of a new business. And so you don't have enough data yet to know whether you are in the 80 or in the 20. And in that situation, it's kind of fairly blind. Now, if you're an established company, you'd look back over the last 5 years of data and you'd see where you're 80 and 20 years. But if you're new, you're just not going to know. And you could really take a punt on the wrong way. And it just struck me as really interesting that as a new start like that, you could really fall the wrong way.
So this is a known problem, particularly in indie publishers and record labels, right?
Yeah.
So I think a classic example was Nirvana, who were on Sub Pop when they exploded. And maybe they'd already moved to a major. But what happens a lot of the time is that indie labels are going to be indie labels. It's really, really hard to nestle in with the big boys. You just simply won't have the scale and the distribution, and the big distributors aren't willing to play nicely with tiny little indie labels who, I've got these 10 power metal bands, right? And they all make a tiny bit of money and so on. And then someone on your books goes stratospheric. And what happens a lot of the time is that for the indie label is death, right? They simply cannot, and the same goes for publishers, they simply cannot fulfill that level of demand within the relationships that they have. And the big labels and publishers turn up and say, well, we're not going to help you. You'll go under, or you're just going to give this band stroke author to us, right? And what happens then is a lot of the time is that either the indie sort of goes into partnership, i.e. they get to put their badge on the book stroke record, and pretty much loses that artist, right? Or they just sell the rights outright, right? They just say, no, you buy the rights to publish and record this artist from me, and it's been lovely working with you, but see you later, Kurt Cobain or whoever it is that you've been working with, and so there is a sort of choice there that the odd time a small publisher or a label will go all out because they've got 1 or 2 breakouts to try and challenge the majors, but from things like distribution, you're either in the club or you're not. So it can happen, but it's very, very unusual, right? Yeah. And indies want to be indies, right? They want to carry on being able to float this really odd power metal meets K-pop, hybrid subgenre, and that's all they ever want to do, right? The idea that they would get a mega hit is anathema, right? Yeah. So, but the thing is, you're right. I don't think Sub Pop knew what they had on their hands with Nirvana, right? Mm-hmm. And there's any number of other stories like this. Yeah. And so, from a data perspective, where are you at with that, right? And all that jumped into my mind with this is, what do you do, right? I just want to be an indie, right? Yeah. You can either go and look for really crap, really bad writers, right? And hope you don't accidentally get a Richard Osmond. But that actually it's a bit like earthquakes, isn't it?
Mhm.
Right. So if you can model it, right? If you know roughly what the proportion of uh, big authors are, as opposed to, because there's like literally, you probably live in a street with like 9 other authors, right? Everyone is a bloody author these days. Even published authors, they're bloody 10 a penny, right? So the chances of you getting a J.K. Rowling or a Richard Osman or whoever is the current, flavour of the month is quite low. But when it happens, it's going to bulldoze your house, right?
Yeah.
And it's just like earthquakes, right?
Yeah.
It's a power law distribution, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And that's how to think about it.
Yeah.
But it's not quite lottery winning, right? Either,
Yeah.
right? So it's not 1 in 45 million or whatever that is
Yeah.
for the lottery. I don't know what it is these
Yeah.
days because they've changed it. But it's like you need your Poisson distribution, don't you?
Yeah. Well, and this is what made me think is when you read up on it, it says it's not a law, but it feels like from a data and statistical point of view, is that look, if you start a company and you've got a bunch of clients, once you get 100 clients in, you're going to find you've got a couple of clients for whatever reason that are starting to lead the pack, and then might lead them twofold, threefold, tenfold, And to take this fully into the business context, we've worked with companies, that have got big and expanded over the years. And potentially this is actually the story of expansion, which says, well, I know my client base is here, and I'm an indie record producer, or I've got a couple of big clients, but I'm struggling to service them. And so I need to join up with another record producer that's more, which is larger on the distribution side, so that we can now start to distribute that and maintain that. And then at the same time, we can add, personalization to the other labels' clients, because they're bigger distribution, and then we get their bigger distribution. So that's kind of the merger story. And then what you've done there is you've merged 2 sets of clients. Now you've got a lot more, low level clients, and then probably quite a few more bigger ones. And then, companies do this more and more. And so what's always happening is you're getting bigger and bigger clients who are now 10, 20, 30, 50 fold, and more volume of smaller clients. And I think having the realize, I don't think there's a right answer as to whether that's good or bad. But I think being cognizant of it is really important for your business strategy. And sometimes I'm not so sure that businesses really acknowledge it. And one of the epiphanies I had when I was looking at this a few weeks back was I remember having a conversation, and I've had it several times over the years with people, I'm sure you have as well, where people say, we've got these 10% clients here, we may as well drop everyone else because, these guys are bringing in, like 90% of our revenue. So why do we, if we've got 10 customers, well, what are we doing with the other 90? In fact, to service the other 90 is what most of our workforce is doing. The top 10, we don't have that many people doing it. So why don't we just keep them? And I've fallen into that trap, I think, a few times. I thought, yeah, that's a good point. Why don't they just do that? And then you realize, yeah, so if you do that, then you are massively increasing your risk, because you've only got 10 clients now. And if one of them leaves, that's 10% of your revenue down the drain. And going statistically speaking, you will lose one of those clients for whatever reason, in the coming years, at least. And then the other thing, and I remember thinking about this before, is that if your workforce is spending a lot of their time servicing the smaller clients, well, that's kind of a training ground for the big guys, right? And if you get rid of the lower ones, well, what are these people going to do?
Well, that's also your flex, right? So big client X suddenly has this really big project, and they need bodies, right?
Yeah.
And therefore you can start pulling them off smaller clients. You can dump a few clients if you want. And what you're also saying about the big clients isn't that they've got 500 consultants working on one client, it's that they get big old margins, right? And the problem with the 90% of the rest of it is that they're much lower margin, but they're the engine of your business, right?
Yeah.
And as you say, if you get rid of them all, you lose scale, you lose bodies, you lose flex, and it's worth keeping them around. You lose your factory of future high margin consultants or accountants or whatever it is.
Yeah, very good. Well, so that's keep in mind, look out for the 80/20s in life, because they're everywhere.
Well, that was an interesting, rather left field discussion. I've got another monologue on polars to do, which we agreed before this that I wouldn't talk about today because it would take another hour. So I think I'll be back with a chat about polars next week, and we'll see what else happens between now and then.
Sounds good.
Right. Have a lovely day. I'll speak to you soon.
Yeah, great. Thanks.
Bye, everybody.
The confusion matrix.